Have you ever had the quiet sense that you've lived this exact emotional pattern before? Not the event itself, but the feeling of pushing against something invisible that never quite moves. You wake up, check your phone, scroll through the same rhythms of outrage and ambition, and somewhere between the first sip of coffee and the second email, there's a flicker, subtle, almost embarrassing, that something about this loop doesn't add up. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly misaligned. You try harder. You call it discipline. You call it growth. But beneath the effort, there's a pressure that doesn't feel constructive, more like friction inside a system you didn't design. Quantum consciousness suggests that what we experience as struggle may not be force against reality, but interference within a hidden reality we rarely question. You tell yourself resistance builds character, yet the resistance feels circular, like walking into wind that never shifts direction. No one talks about that part, the part where the effort itself might be the distortion. And if that distortion is structural, not personal, then leaving now would mean missing the moment where the pattern finally becomes visible. And if that recognition feels uncomfortably familiar, there's no need to signal it loudly. Sometimes acknowledgement happens quietly, almost privately, like a subtle internal nod that says, yes, that's it. Continuing here isn't about subscribing to an idea, it's about staying with a question long enough to see what it reveals. If something shifted in you, complete this thought in the comments. I notice that I resist most when, because before we talk about change, we need to understand what resistance actually does to the system beneath it. In 1978, physicist John Archibald Wheeler proposed what became known as the delayed choice experiment, later tested in variations by researchers including Alain Aspect in the early 1980s at the University of Paris-Sud. The question was deceptively simple. Does a particle decide whether to behave like a wave or a particle before we observe it? Or does the act of observation determine how it behaved all along? In these experiments, photons were sent toward a detector in a setup where the measurement choice could be altered after the photon had already passed a critical point. What emerged was unsettling. The behavior of the photon seemed to depend on how it was ultimately observed, as if the measurement reached backward through the quantum field and shaped the outcome retroactively. This is what we call the observer effect, not the mystical idea that thoughts magically control reality, but the measurable fact that observation participates in the structure of what becomes real. And this means that you are not merely reacting to a fixed external world. Your mode of attention alters the configuration of your experience, not in a theatrical way, in a structural one. When you approach life through resistance, through tension and constant opposition, your nervous system becomes the measurement device. It collapses possibilities into predictable outcomes. The quantum field holds multiple potentials, but attention narrows them. Resistance is a form of observation, tight, defensive, hyper-focused. And over time, that mode conditions perception itself. Consciousness expansion, in this context, isn't about believing in something abstract. It's about recognizing how the quality of your attention sculpts the reality you step into. If the observer influences the outcome at the smallest scale, what happens when your dominant observation is struggle? What does that select for? And more importantly, what alternative states have you never allowed yourself to measure? What alternative states have you never allowed yourself to measure? In 1990, physicist and mathematician Roger Penrose, later collaborating with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff at the University of Arizona, proposed a controversial but rigorously structured model known as orchestrated objective reduction. While debated, parts of their work intersected with measurable findings in neuroscience. That micro-level coherence inside neural structures may influence large-scale perception. More broadly accepted, however, are studies on neural coherence itself, particularly research from institutions like the HeartMath Institute and independent EEG laboratories, showing that when different regions of the brain synchronize in coherent wave patterns, perception becomes clearer, reaction times stabilize, and emotional regulation improves. Coherence is not mystical, it's measurable synchronization. And this explains why there are moments, rare but undeniable, when something inside you suddenly aligns. A quiet internal stillness, a decision that feels obvious without overthinking, a split second of intuition where your body relaxes before your mind catches up. Your shoulders drop, your breathing deepens, the noise recedes. That sensation isn't magic, it's pattern stabilization. When neural networks oscillate in coordinated rhythms, interference drops. Perception sharpens. The system stops fighting itself. And when interference increases, when stress hormones spike, when attention fragments across too many competing demands, coherence collapses. You don't just feel anxious, you feel internally divided. Science calls this desynchronization. Your body calls it tension. Your mind calls it overthinking. And this means resistance isn't merely psychological stubbornness, it is physiological incoherence. A state where different internal systems are pulling in opposite directions. One part of you pushing forward, another bracing against imagined threat. The field of perception narrows. Options feel constrained. Reality hardens. But coherence has a cost. Because the moment your system begins to stabilize, you start noticing where you've been operating out of distortion. You feel the environments that disrupt you, the conversations that fragment you, the ambitions that create internal friction instead of expansion. And once you feel that difference clearly, returning to unconscious resistance becomes harder. And once you feel that difference clearly, returning to unconscious resistance becomes harder. That's the part no one romanticizes. Because awareness doesn't just expand perception, it isolates you for a while. You start noticing how often conversations revolve around stress as status, how exhaustion is worn like credibility, how pushing through is praised more than stepping back. And when you no longer resonate with that rhythm, you don't necessarily feel enlightened. You feel slightly displaced, not superior, not awakened, just out of sync. There's a quiet loneliness in that stage. You question yourself. You wonder if you've become too sensitive, too reflective, too distant. You miss the simplicity of not noticing, of just running on momentum without asking whether the direction made sense. And doubt creeps in. Maybe the resistance was necessary. Maybe coherence is just another illusion. Maybe discomfort is safer than uncertainty. It's unsettling to realize that some of the struggle you carried like armor was actually distortion. Because letting go of distortion means letting go of identity layers built around it. And when those layers loosen, there's a gap. A subtle, undefined space where you're not who you were, but not yet fully aligned either. That space can feel empty. But emptiness isn't the end of something. It's the point where interference has finally quieted enough for something clearer to emerge. But emptiness isn't the end of something. It's the point where interference has finally quieted enough for something clearer to emerge. Maybe the reason you felt different isn't because you're broken or incompatible. Maybe it's because you've been perceiving more variables than you were taught to account for. Earlier, we looked at the observer effect and how attention shapes outcomes within the quantum field. We explored coherence, how synchronization within systems creates clarity, and how resistance fragments perception. Emotionally, that translated into the tension you feel when parts of you are out of phase. Scientifically, it reflected measurable shifts in attention and neural alignment. Put those together and something unsettling appears. What you labeled as struggle might actually be heightened sensitivity to distortion. What you called overthinking could be early detection. What felt like not belonging might be expanded awareness colliding with environments built for noise. There's a cost to that, but there's also precision. If consciousness is not passive, if observation participates in shaping experience, then a person who detects misalignment isn't defective. They are registering interference others filter out. In a system where most people normalize fragmentation, coherence can look unusual. Stability can look strange. Silence can look suspicious. And here's the part we don't resolve tonight. What if reality itself responds differently to those who perceive more of it? Not magically, not dramatically, but structurally. What if consciousness expansion isn't about escaping this world, but interacting with it at a different resolution? That possibility changes how resistance feels. It shifts suffering from identity to signal. And once you see suffering as signal rather than destiny, something irreversible happens. You don't immediately transform, but you can't unknow it. And that subtle shift may be the beginning of something far more consequential than growth. And maybe that's the quiet shift this entire conversation was pointing toward. Not fixing yourself, not forcing change, just recognizing that what felt like friction might have been feedback all along. If something in you stayed with this until now, that wasn't random. Staying aware is a form of continuity. The next layer of this journey unfolds in, what is resistance? And why does it make you suffer? Because understanding interference is one thing, seeing how you sustain it is another. Your consciousness brought you here. What happens now is your choice.